When the question of the first horror game comes up, the poorly kept early history of video games as a whole becomes an obstacle. You could find conversations about what the first horror game is bring up seemingly lost cabinets of uncertain construction, or a scene in the 1975 movie JAWS, in which it cuts the gameplay footage of an arcade game called Killer Shark, where the player is a deep-sea diver armed with a spear gun shooting said killer shark who appears from the darkness of the deep ocean. The arcade cabinet has a Sega logo, with various websites citing it as having a 1972 release in the US with no month or day specified. There's also a flyer circulating that shows the machine with 2 play prices, whose currency implies a Japanese release that may have been simultaneous or prior, considering the space for its second coin slot still exists in all the pictures of the US release. Both sensible information and interest in this game are sparse due to its stroboscopic disc approach to film being considered so primitive that it becomes divisive as to if people even consider it video, thus making its historical value as a video game as divisive, causing the credit of the earliest known horror game to often be split between it and another 1972 game, Haunted House. That's right. When attempting to provide a variety of first-party games for their new home console, horror would be a genre that joined the likes of sports, education, and science fiction games the Odyssey would see. While the creative mind behind the console would be against packing in games that required more than the TV and controller to play, the console was under Magnavox, who would ultimately lean into the more board game design relying on physical pieces and attempting to capture the family market. Released around September of '72, Haunted House would take advantage of the video game format by having a multiplayer game where one player is a ghost that could hide within things, with the illumination of their body standing out while also blending in with the natural illumination of a CRT screen that lit the entire environment. The other player would be the detective attempting to survive exploring the mansion with physical cards guiding the game without having to approach condensing text into hardware which was meant to be cheap and thus simple. The game's approach to horror relied on the tension of anticipating a failure state that allowed the player controlling the ghost to initiate a jump scare that would flash the screen white while they screamed boo. Real scary, I know. After arcade and console players got their horror fix, the following year would see the release of a desktop computer horror game that would rely less on visuals and more on painting a picture through text like a horror novel. Gregory Yob found the output of the trend of hide-and-seek games published by People's Computer Company to be underwhelming considering what could be accomplished. He would avoid the easy grid pattern level design and have the player explore a cave system where a man-eating beast called the Wumpus was sleeping somewhere around. Also within the cave were bottomless pits and bats so great they can carry a person right off. The player armed with 5 crooked arrows named for their unrealistically generous movement through the air in the game's dodecahedron-shaped world would need to explore the cave system to hunt the Wumpus in complete darkness, via their other senses like smell and feel, as the light would alert the beast. And if you move too close to it, you turn into its prey. Because of this, it's retroactively referred to as the earliest known example of a survival horror game. Exploring its cave system, managing your limited arrows to hunt the monster while trying not to squander your limited inventory and become its prey. It was sold via mail order in 1973, and People's Computer Company, who advertised it as a possible tool to teach first graders math, is credited as its publisher. By 1975, multiple horror games were being released per year. Hunt the Wumpus' source code was published in Creative Computing magazine and became a series with port sequels and custom alterations. Wumpus 2 would focus on replayability, its new cave systems bringing changing difficulty and strategy being described as the same old Wumpus in a different setting, including those of your own design, referring to the ability to create your own cave system in this new entry. Wumpus 3 would advertise new hazards to the mix, like earthquakes and bat migrations. Jack Emmerichs would be credited with the creation of Super Wumpus, a more complex version of Wumpus where the beast would be aggressively active, while an Altair 8800 parody of the original titled Wampus would give players the option to primarily try to escape the cave and avoid confrontation altogether. In 1975, Project Support Engineering released Maneater, advertising up to 2 players can indulge in its video terror, controlling divers in shark-infested waters. Players would retrieve packages from the bottom and bring them to the surface. And this would be far from the last shark game. Just as Killer Shark was featured in the movie JAWS, on September 25th, JAWS would have its own unofficial game. Video game adaptations of media predate Pong, and Pong's company Atari would join in on this, forming Horror Games, a front to take the bullet in case they were sued for their unlicensed adaptation, sharkJAWS, though keen eyes would recognize it using an Atari Tank 2 cabinet. And those who got inside might note a circuit board marked Atari, whose marketing VP is quoted as saying the company behind JAWS would find out Atari was behind Horror Games in only 3 days. Advertised as exciting underwater video terror, sharkJAWS had you swimming for fish in a third person while trying to avoid being shark food. It's been praised for its sound design using heavy reverb to emulate its setting, and despite claims of it selling thousands, Tracking serial numbers have led to collectors finding it more likely only had 500 ever even made. Coincidentally, much like Killer Shark, it too would be used in a movie, and 3 years after its release to boot. And games in the horror genre would of course eventually attract backlash. In December of 1975, Destruction Derby would release, where the player controlling a car would attempt to ram into others. It was licensed to Chicago Coin by Exidy, who would clone the game to also profit from it, without competing with their licensee. New hire Howell Ivey said the easy approach would be to replace the visuals, which was done by replacing the other cars with fleeing people. Allegedly titled Pedestrian before becoming Death Race 98 and then shortened to Death Race, the cabinet featured 2 Grim Reapers driving cars, with pedestrians being named Gremlins who would scream upon being run over. A reporter would see kids lined up to play Death Race and run a story in Seattle, beginning a snowball of media covering the controversial game about running over fleeing pedestrians.
It again sanctions practice, training, learning how to hurt, kill other people. It sets the stage for when people are instigated to aggression to use those skills that they have.
If you drive LA traffic, and I'm a deliverer myself, you get tired of pedestrians, and these little things, kind of remind me of pedestrians.
Kind of like hitting people, but kind of not. They're just little ghosts, I don't know. Just little people running around.
Becoming taboo, of course, caused the game's sales to shoot from hundreds to thousands, with video game magazines reporting it in the top 10 highest-selling grossing arcade games for 2 years. Also on the market in 1977 was a new 3-in-1 arcade cabinet by Atari, Triple Hunt. A collection of shooting games featuring Raccoon Hunt, where you shoot raccoons before they get to the top of a tree. Hit the Bear, where you take aim at bears with attached targets that, because the sprites display horizontally stretched, look more like eyes, that I may have used to clickbait you. And a game called Witch Hunt, where you're firing at a haunted mansion, where a witch circles the sky. The game tracks the gun's position on the screen via 2 potentiometers in the gun, while a display mask and a one-way mirror in front of the monitor let light through and reflect the game's sprites, creating a sense of depth and allowing them to pass behind and in front of objects. This allows the game to advertise multiple 3D environments. The game's creator Owen Rubin would explain that the more complex method of gun tracking was chosen over using a light gun sensing the sprites when they're not behind objects, out of fear that outside lights like fluorescence would get in the way. This cabinet's construction is an example of how I think so much of the experience is often lost when trying to translate an arcade game to a 2D screen. So much of the experience is in the cabinet's construction itself, which is often not even attempted to be replicated. The game's spooky sound design would come from a combination of the game's microprocessor producing sound effects and an 8-track tape producing the ambient environmental noise. Witch Hunt would have the most tape, and would not be the only witch game of this era. Perhaps the most well-known thing about Salem, Massachusetts is the witch trials of the 1600s. During the time stood the Turner House, that would eventually sell to the family of Susanna Ingersoll, who would entertain her cousin there, telling him stories of its old history. The attic had bits of framing and plaster from former Gables built in 1668. This cousin would make the house famous by being inspired to write the 1851 novel, The House of Seven Gables. The house is now an icon of Salem, becoming a museum and one with a horror game. Greg Hassett's 1978 text game The House of Seven Gables advertises you raid for valuables, but must defeat the witch to escape. And said witch is not the only danger. Lurking the house are life-threatening ghouls who you can throw chemicals in their face. A ghost who also doesn't want you to leave with valuables and is life-threatening himself if you refuse to relinquish your plunder. There's even a vampire who you can drive off with garlic found in the kitchen, but it won't work forever, so you might want to prepare to combat it a different way. The number of horror games released was increasing every year, but what even constitutes a video game is divisive. From Killer Shark's stroboscopic disc approach, to Haunted House's absence of memory or a processor, to the House of Seven Gables' absence of motion picture. The line of what is video and what are video games may be forever debated, and especially when a game lacks a stereotypically horror setting or characters, it can become as divisive to decipher which game's creators' intentions were horror, or if that's even what you define as a horror game. What is certain is the word horror can catch the interest of many people who previously enjoyed media, described as such. I'm Oak Taro.